President Biden tries to save the Iran nuclear deal, but Iran has its own demands. And is the deal even worth saving? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell on so you can be the first to watch our new episodes every week. During Joe Biden's presidential campaign, he promised that America would rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. So why would Biden want to rejoin the deal that Trump called the worst deal ever? Well, Biden said that Trump pulling the U.S. out of the nuclear deal made things worse, like by isolating the U.S., raising tensions with Europe, and pushing countries like China and Russia closer to Iran. Okay, to be fair, Russia and China didn't need much of a push to get closer to Iran. They were already very, very close. But anyway, Biden accused Trump of letting Iran off the hook from its obligations under the nuclear deal, which then allowed Iran to speed up their breakout time. That's the amount of time it would take for Iran to get enough material to build one nuclear bomb. Instead of calling it breakout time, they should really call it fallout time. But unlike Trump, Biden is going to get Iran back on the hook. How? With diplomacy. Biden has pledged to offer Tehran a credible path back to diplomacy. If Iran returns to strict compliance with the nuclear deal, the U.S. would rejoin the agreement as a starting point for follow-on negotiations, assuming, of course, that Iran had been strictly complying with the deal in the first place. But more about that later. The point is, if Iran shapes up, the U.S. will rejoin the deal. Diplomacy wins. But that's not exactly how Iran sees it. Instead, Iran's supreme leader has demanded action from Biden to revive the nuclear deal. Specifically, Iran wants the U.S. to lift its economic sanctions before they will agree to comply with the nuclear deal. But Biden says the U.S. won't lift those sanctions until Iran returns to the nuclear deal. So the U.S. and Iran are trying to push each other to see who blinks first. Diplomacy is sounding a lot like a game of chicken. Nuclear chicken. It turns out that diplomacy is easier to promise than to actually deliver, especially when you're dealing with an authoritarian regime that hates your guts. But before we go on, a quick recap of the original Iran nuclear deal. The deal was the brainchild of President Barack Obama, and it was signed back in 2015 by the U.S., Iran, and 5 other nations, plus the EU. The official name of the deal is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA for short, because governments like to find the most confusing and awkward acronyms possible, so no one understands what they're doing. What's actually in the JCPOA? Take it away, 2017 Chris. Put simply, Iran agrees to give up 98% of its enriched uranium and stop pursuing nuclear weapons for 10 to 15 years. There are a bunch of specific things they have to do, and their nuclear program is heavily monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the global nuclear watchdog. And in exchange, the U.S. and these other big countries agree to unfreeze $150 billion of Iranian assets, plus gradually lift trade sanctions so Iran can do business with the West. President Trump was not a big fan of the whole unfreezing Iranian assets and lifting trade sanctions thing. According to Trump, Iran was using that money to fund terrorism and create instability in the Middle East.
Rather than use its resources to improve Iranian lives, its oil profits go to fund Hezbollah and other terrorists that kill innocent Muslims and attack their peaceful Arab and Israeli neighbors. This wealth, which rightly belongs to Iran's people, also goes to shore up Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship, fuel Yemen's civil war, and undermine peace throughout the entire Middle East.
Trump was also not a fan of the deal's limited restrictions on Iran's nuclear development. For example, some of the restrictions simply expired after 10 to 15 years. And while the deal slowed down Iran's development of nuclear weapons, it didn't completely stop it. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. During the several years that Obama's nuclear deal was in place, Iran did supposedly slow down its nuclear development. But it didn't actually stop. Iran also violated a resolution they signed along with the nuclear deal back in 2015. That resolution said that they would not undertake any activity related to ballistic missiles designed to be delivering nuclear weapons, including launches using such ballistic missile technology. Yeah, they violated that way back in 2016, during the Obama administration. Whether you like Trump or not, there were some valid points that he made. Missiles, after all, are an important part of nuclear weapons. There's also the issue of whether Iran was violating the nuclear deal itself. Even before the U.S. backed out of the deal, Iran had exceeded the limits of the deal several times, according to the UN. And in 2018, Israel's prime minister accused Iran of lying and secretly continuing their nuclear program. You know it's serious when the prime minister puts it in a PowerPoint presentation. Meanwhile, after the U.S. left the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, Iran's behavior got worse. That's because the U.S. reimposed economic sanctions on Iran. Since then, Iran has raised its levels of uranium enrichment and breached limits on its allowed stockpile to pressure the European partners in the deal to provide sanctions relief. The Iranian regime absolutely hates the U.S. sanctions. Sanctions on oil sales and on Iran's banking system have slashed the country's exports, deprived it of foreign exchange, sent Iran's currency plummeting, and accelerated inflation. According to Iran's foreign minister, U.S. sanctions have cost Iran $1 trillion of economic damage. This is a huge problem for Iran's leaders, because economic stability keeps the regime in power. The worse Iran's economy gets, the more likely there will be protests and other unrest. So in 2019, Iran escalated its violations of the JCPOA as a way of putting pressure on Europe to get the U.S. to lift its sanctions. Basically, Iran is saying it will keep acting out until the U.S. stops punishing it, and then it will go back to being well-behaved. I like to call it tantrum diplomacy, because it's pretty much the same strategy I used whenever my dad tried to put me in timeout. For some reason, tantrum diplomacy never worked out well for me. But apparently, the U.S. is less scary than my dad, because Iran is escalating even further. Since the 2020 election, Iran has pushed its uranium enrichment up from 4.5% to 20%. That's the same level it achieved before the nuclear deal. According to the deal, they're supposed to cap enrichment at 3.67%. But this isn't even Iran's final form. The Ayatollahs said that they can even bring their enrichment up to 60%. To be weapons grade, uranium needs to be enriched to 90%. But don't worry, because Iran says its enrichment program is for peaceful energy purposes only, which is why it's going to keep enriching more uranium unless the U.S. lifts its sanctions. But again, Biden has said he's not going to lift sanctions unless Iran first cuts its uranium enrichment, which is how we got to nuclear chicken. Obviously, the U.S. wants Iran to stop developing nuclear weapons, but there are other countries that have a whole lot more to lose. I'll be right back with more. Welcome back. Speaking of nuclear chicken, a recent Atlantic article claims that the Iran deal did not slow or stop Iran's nuclear ambitions. It points out that Israelis and Arabs have the most to lose from Iran getting nuclear weapons, and they are not demanding a return to the deal. Why aren't they panicking over the fact that the deal's falling apart? According to the article, the JCPOA didn't diminish the Iranian nuclear threat. It magnified it. So who really wants to get the Iran deal back? The US, the European Union, and Iran. Especially Iran, because it wants to get rid of the US sanctions. How Biden can get everyone back into the deal, however, is something that aides within the Biden administration are debating over. But Biden is getting some help from European leaders who also really want to save this nuclear deal. Earlier this month, German Chancellor Angela Merkel encouraged Iran's president to increase the chances of a diplomatic solution. This issue has been complicated, however, by the fact that Iran is interfering with inspectors from the IAEA, the international nuclear watchdog that's supposed to be monitoring Iran's nuclear program. Last month, Iran passed a law to stop snap inspections from the IAEA. Iran said it would no longer grant daily access to United Nations inspectors to its nuclear facilities or provide round-the-clock security footage of its activities at these sites. That happened after the IAEA told member states that Iran had begun producing uranium metal, a material vital for nuclear weapons. That's another violation of the nuclear deal. And since there's not a lot of use for uranium metal outside of nuclear weapons, it also makes Iran look even more sus. But in the spirit of diplomacy, the chief of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, recently went on a trip to Iran to negotiate continued inspections. He came back and said that he reached some technical understanding earlier this week. In short, the UN technically will have less access to Iran's nuclear program.
Will there be a change in the number of designated inspectors for Iran and the number of inspectors present?
No.
No change.
What changes is the type of activity and a number of things that will be happening.
So good news. The number of inspectors would stay the same. It's just that the type of activity that the IAEA can do changes. Hopefully it doesn't change to being locked in a hotel room far away from Iran's nuclear sites. But Europe and the US aren't too happy about Iran's shenanigans with the IAEA, which is why they're pushing the IAEA to issue a resolution criticizing Iran for curbing their cooperation with the agency. And Iran isn't happy about that, which is why Iran is threatening to quit the IAEA pact completely if it gets officially censured. Tantrum diplomacy in action. But it's not just the IAEA issue that's complicating the negotiations between the US and Iran. There's also the tiny matter of the US dropping bombs on Iranian-backed militia in Syria last week. President Biden ordered the airstrike after determining that Iran supported those militias' rocket attacks against US personnel in Iraq. The strike was calculated to signal to Iran that such attacks through proxies in the region would not be tolerated, US officials said, while avoiding escalation into a wider conflict as Biden seeks a diplomatic breakthrough with Tehran on the Iran nuclear deal. Still, Iran probably wasn't happy about the attack. But if you're thinking, well, Iran has already violated the nuclear deal by enriching uranium, making uranium metal, and limiting the IAEA inspections, what else can it do? Well, the answer is reject direct diplomatic talks with the US. Don't worry, this doesn't quash the deal, according to Western diplomats. I mean, they're diplomats. What are they going to say? I guess diplomacy doesn't work. Everything we've devoted our lives to is a lie. But essentially, the US and Iran are now stuck in a diplomatic stalemate. Neither side seems to want to budge, at least for now. The only question is, who will win nuclear chicken? So what do you think of the Iran nuclear deal? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, America Uncovered is supported mainly by viewers. So visit patreon.com/AmericaUncovered. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.